On the afternoon of 16th of February, 1892, in the brownstone at 350 Fifth Avenue, New York, the light from the winter windows fell across a low table, scattered with calling cards and a single folded newspaper. Caroline Astor, the Mrs. Astor, pauses before the mirror, adjusting the fingers of her pale kidskin gloves with practiced precision. Behind her, the house is already half prepared for the next ball. Flowers arriving, footmen polishing silver. The ballroom doors close like a stage waiting for its cast. In the New York Times on that day, Ward McAllister's official list of the 400 appears in print, confirming in cold type what society has whispered for years. There are only so many who count. She smooths one card to the top of the stack and reaches for her pen. The gloves that once symbolized protection now serve as insignia of command, and quietly, of cost. By the early 1890s, New York understood that Caroline Astor, born into an old Knickerbocker merchant family in 1830 and married into the fur and real estate Astors in 1853, was not merely a hostess. She was an institution. From the brownstone at 350 Fifth Avenue and the Summer Estate Beechwood in Newport, she curated a world in which invitations were currency, guest list policy, and a misplaced calling card could alter a family's trajectory. Newspapers would later reduce this power to a number, the 400, and to a sentence from Ward McAllister. There are only about 400 people in fashionable New York society, but behind that sentence lay decades of training, exclusion, and choreography, much of it performed by women whose grace was both art and armor. This narrative follows Mrs. Astor through that architecture of privilege, from schoolroom to ballroom, to ask what it meant to be the woman who decided, who mattered. In late autumn 1843, on Bond Street in New York, the young Caroline Lena Schermerhorn leaves the family house near Lafayette Place, her gloved hand held by a maid as carriage wheels rattle past the pavements of what contemporaries called the city's best quarter. Her father, Abraham Schermerhorn, has already made a fortune in shipping. Her mother, Helen Van Cortlandt White Schermerhorn, guards a lineage that reaches back to Dutch colonial days. An early biographical notice places her birth at Greenwich Street and traces the family's move uptown as Lower Manhattan grows crowded, a migration that mirrors the slow northward drift of elite New York. A later genealogical chronicle of the Schermerhorns lists Lena among 9 children, each name bracketed by marriages, estates, and inheritances, an early paper architecture of duty. The Bond Street neighborhood in the 1840s represents New York's aspirational geography. Greek Revival townhouses with marble stoops, gaslight flickering in evening windows, the rustle of silk as families return from Trinity Church on Sundays. Contemporary city directories show the Schermerhorns living among other merchant families, the Beekmans, the Rhinelanders, the Van Rensselaers, names that will appear again and again in the social choreography Lena will later master. The street itself is quiet, residential, insulated from the noise and commerce of Lower Broadway by deliberate urban planning and the invisible boundaries of class. At the door, she pauses, tugging once at the wrist of her glove, a small correction of posture before stepping into the street. The gesture is unremarkable, practiced 1,000 times before mirrors and in drawing rooms where deportment is scrutinized as carefully as lineage. Her gloves, likely white kid leather for daytime, fasten with tiny pearl buttons that require patience and dexterity. The material is soft but restrictive, a second skin that must be kept immaculate. Any stain, any tear, any wrinkle signals carelessness. From the beginning, her world feels expansive in space, but narrow in permissible paths. The Schermerhorn fortune affords comfort, education, travel. The Schermerhorn name demands performance, discretion, strategic marriage. Inside the house, the daily rhythm follows patterns documented in contemporary household manuals: morning prayers, breakfast served in imported china, lessons with tutors in French and music, afternoon calls received in the front parlor. The Schermerhorn children, 9 in total, though not all survive to adulthood, are raised with the expectation that they will maintain and enhance the family's position. For the daughters, this means cultivating accomplishments that signal refinement without suggesting intellectual presumption. Fluent French, competent piano, graceful dancing, exquisite needlework, and above all, the ability to navigate social situations with tact and composure. Within a decade, that gloved hand will sign a marriage register linking Knickerbocker pedigree to Astor wealth, binding two fortunes, and with them, a life to obligations those fortunes entail. On 23 September 1853, the bells of Trinity Church on Broadway marked the wedding of Caroline Schermerhorn and William Backhouse Astor Jr., middle son of William B. Astor Sr. and grandson of fur trader John Jacob Astor. Marriage notices in New York papers record the union in formal phrases. Later family histories will emphasize the merger of old Dutch respectability and newer, immense real estate wealth. In the pews, gloves rustle against prayer books, and the young bride's trousseau, carefully listed in household papers, signals both taste and expectation. Trinity Church, rebuilt after a fire in 1839, stands as one of New York's architectural landmarks. Gothic revival spires rising above the commercial district, its interior shadowed and solemn. Contemporary accounts describe weddings there as carefully orchestrated events, with families hiring the same florists, musicians, and caterers trusted by their circle. The ceremony itself follows Episcopal liturgy, but the social choreography surrounding it, who sits where, who processes in what order, who receives at the reception, constitutes a parallel ritual equally binding. William Backhouse, Astor Jr., 26 at the time of the marriage, is described in family records as a quiet man more interested in horses and yachting than in business or society. His fortune, however, is indisputable. As the middle son, he will inherit a substantial share of the Astor real estate empire, properties that generate income through Manhattan's relentless northward expansion. The marriage settlement, drawn up by lawyers in the weeks before the wedding, secures Lena's financial position while binding her to the Astor family's expectations and obligations. Within a decade, the couple will build a 4-bay brownstone at 350 Fifth Avenue, next door to William's elder brother, John Jacob Astor III. The new house, photographed repeatedly in the 1860s and 1870s, stands as much for a social claim as for domestic comfort. Its interiors, described in later architectural surveys, balance the restrained elegance expected of old New York with the scale that Astor wealth permits. High ceilings with ornate plasterwork, imported marble mantels, a ballroom capable of receiving 200 guests. Contemporary etiquette manuals make clear that such spaces were not simply decorated, but calibrated. Every element, from the placement of mirrors to the width of doorways, was designed to facilitate the rituals of calling, dining, and dancing that constituted social life. The ballroom becomes the house's symbolic center. Measuring approximately 40 feet long and 30 feet wide, it features parquet floors imported from France, crystal chandeliers purchased in Venice, and floor-to-ceiling windows draped in velvet. A contemporary visitor describes entering the space on an evening in the 1870s. One passed through folding doors of polished mahogany into a room that seemed to shimmer with reflected light, mirrors multiplying the glow of candles, gilt frames catching the gleam, and everywhere the rustle of silk as ladies adjusted their trains and gentlemen smoothed their white gloves. As Lena crosses the church threshold on her wedding day, she again adjusts the fingers of her gloves before accepting congratulations. A small gesture, already a habit, sealing the passage from daughter to Astor matron. The marriage contract, documented in church and city records, binds two fortunes, but it also binds a life to the obligations those fortunes entail. Producing heirs, maintaining alliances, presiding over a household staff that will eventually number more than 20, and navigating the intricate hierarchies of New York society with a skill that transforms hospitality into governance. The next house she oversees will contain a ballroom whose door decides which New Yorkers count. By the early 1880s, the Astors' social authority was visible not only on Fifth Avenue, but on Bellevue. Avenue in Newport, Rhode Island. In 1880, William Astor purchased Beechwood, an Italianate villa soon transformed under the direction of architect Richard Morris Hunt. Between 1888 and 1890, Mrs. Astor commissioned a new ballroom and enlarged dining rooms to host her expanding circle. Travel guides and later architectural histories note that the Beechwood Ballroom was deliberately sized to receive the 400, echoing the capacity of her New York ballroom. Newport magazines, looking back on the period, describe Mrs. Astor's summer ball as the highlight of the season: 10-course dinners, large orchestras, and a terrace opening onto the Atlantic. The Newport season, by the 1880s, had evolved into a parallel social calendar as important as New York's winter season. Families close their Fifth Avenue residences in late June and migrate to cottages, a term that belies the scale of these estates, for a summer of elaborate entertaining. The migration itself is a logistical feat. Entire households move, bringing servants, wardrobes, silver, and often horses. Contemporary accounts describe special railroad cars chartered for the journey, trunks marked with family crests, and the coordinated arrival of multiple generations at properties along Bellevue Avenue and Ocean Drive. Beechwood, unlike some of the more ostentatious Newport cottages built in the 1890s, retains a measure of restraint. The original Italianate structure, with its low-pitched roof and arched windows, is expanded rather than replaced. Hunt's additions, completed between 1888 and 1890, include the famous ballroom, with its gilded ceiling and walls lined with mirrors to create an illusion of infinite space, a conservatory for year-round flowers, and modernized service wings that allow large-scale entertaining without visible disruption. The grounds feature manicured lawns descending toward the cliffs, rose gardens planned to bloom throughout the summer, and a circular drive designed to accommodate dozens of carriages simultaneously. On a July evening around 1890, as carriages line Bellevue Avenue, she stands at the top of the staircase in Newport, one hand resting on the gilded rail, the other smoothing an ivory glove as she prepares to greet each guest by name. The ritual is meticulous. The angle of her nod, the duration of her handclasp, the precise words of welcome calibrated to each visitor's place in the social order. Behind her, the ballroom glows with candlelight reflected in gilt-frame mirrors. Ahead, the garden doors stand open to the summer air, allowing the murmur of fountains to mingle with the first strains of a Strauss waltz. A society reporter permitted to observe the preparations earlier that day described the scene. Roses arrived by the wagon load, their stems wrapped in damp muslin. Footmen carried them to the ballroom, where florists arranged them in tall silver vases along the walls. The dining table, extended to seat 60, was laid with gold-rimmed china and crystal that caught the afternoon light. In the kitchen, French chefs conferred over the evening's 10 courses, while maids polished silver until it gleamed. Architecture and ritual combined to turn hospitality into an instrument of classification. The guest list, refined over weeks, reflects not whim but strategy: which families may safely intermarry, which new fortunes have acquired enough polish to be admitted, which old names must be honored despite dwindling wealth. Newport intensifies these calculations because the season is compressed, just 12 weeks to accomplish what New York's winter season stretches across 6 months. Every invitation matters. Every exclusion registers. Before the ballroom fills, a question emerges: how does a woman learn to wield such silent power? In the decades after the Civil War, New York's fortunes exploded. Railroads, steel, finance, and urban real estate created wealth faster than old families could absorb it. Census records show the city's population doubling between 1860 and 1880, from under 1 million to over 1.9 million residents. New money sought recognition. Old money sought to defend its codes. In this world, education, etiquette, and women's social labor became crucial tools. Finishing schools in Switzerland and elite American academies promised to turn daughters of wealth into polished hostesses, explicitly advertising their role in preparing socialites and wives. Contemporary advertisements for these institutions emphasize accomplishments: fluency in French, German, and Italian, proficiency in music and drawing, mastery of deportment, and the social graces. Against this backdrop, Mrs. Astor's demands for correct visiting cards, introductions, and ball etiquette were not eccentricities. They were a form of governance, codifying standards that separated the established from the aspirational. In the 1840s, long before anyone calls her the Mrs. Astor, Lena attended a school run by Mrs. Benzie, a French émigré in New York, where she learned fluent French and the deportment expected of a young lady. Biographical entries note this early education almost in passing, but it situates her within a broader pattern. Elite daughters drilled in languages, music, and carriage from adolescence. A later historian of Miss Porter's school in Farmington would write that such institutions existed to train girls to become useful Christian wives through academics, moral instruction, and social skills. Mrs. Benzie's Academy, located in a townhouse near Washington Square, represents the intermediate tier of girls' education in antebellum New York, more rigorous than dame schools, less comprehensive than the boarding academies emerging in New England, but focused intently on preparing daughters of merchant families for their social roles. The curriculum, pieced together from contemporary sources, likely included morning French conversation, afternoon lessons in piano or harp, instruction in watercolor, painting and decorative arts, and daily practice in what period manuals called graceful carriage. Young ladies learned to enter a room without appearing to hurry, to sit without slouching, to rise without visible effort, and to modulate their voices to convey both warmth and restraint. Lena's notebooks do not survive, but letters from similar schools record hours spent practicing posture with books balanced on the head, piano scales repeated in carpeted parlors, and letters of thanks copied until the handwriting matched a prescribed ideal. The curriculum emphasized languages: French for conversation, Italian for opera, German for reading, alongside watercolor painting, needlework, and the choreography of formal calls. One alumna's diary from the 1850s describes the routine: rose at 6, prayers at 7, French recitation at 9, drawing at 11, deportment at 2. We practice entering a room with grace until my feet ache. The deportment lessons, in particular, reveal the extent to which physical bearing was understood as moral training. Girls practiced walking with weighted baskets on their heads to perfect their posture, executed hundreds of curtsies to achieve the proper depth and recovery, and rehearsed the complex dance of paying and receiving calls. A contemporary etiquette manual explains, "A lady's carriage reveals her breeding more surely than her words. She must move through a drawing room as if borne on air, acknowledge introductions with neither excessive warmth nor coldness, and depart without creating disturbance. These skills require years of cultivation." She leaves class tugging her gloves straight before taking her seat in the family carriage, the leather a constant reminder to keep wrists and words under control. The gloves themselves, white for daytime, colored for evening, black for morning, constitute a vocabulary of their own, each pair selected for specific occasions and handled with care. Even education, on paper, a privilege, served as rehearsal for a role that allowed little improvisation. The same disciplines will later be imposed by her on hundreds of debutantes seeking entry to her circle. By the 1860s, in the brownstone at 350 Fifth Avenue, Lena Astor presided over a growing household, 5 children, a staff of servants, and the daily choreography of menus, callers, and charity obligations. Contemporary manuals on women's domestic management framed this work as a moral duty. Society columns, when they mention her at all, refer to her as a devoted mother and efficient chatelaine rather than as a public figure. Yet here, education continues in a different register. Daughters learn how to greet callers, how quickly to rise from a chair, how to manage a guest list without ever naming it as power. The household in the 1860s and 1870s operated according to rhythms documented in domestic guides and ladies' magazines of the period. Mrs. Astor rises early, meets with her housekeeper to review the day's menus and approve expenditures, then receives morning callers in the front parlor between 11 and 1 o'clock. Afternoons are reserved for paying calls herself, a ritual that requires careful planning as etiquette demands visits be returned within 3 days, and the order of calls signals relative importance. Evenings bring dinners, receptions, or quiet family time, depending on the season and social calendar. The five Astor children, Emily, Helen, Charlotte, Caroline, Carrie, and John Jacob IV, grow up observing their mother's daily performance of domestic authority. The daughters, in particular, receive training that mirrors Lena's own education, but intensified by their greater wealth and higher expectations. They learn French from native speakers, study piano with concert musicians, and practice dancing with professional instructors. More subtly, they absorb the protocols of their mother's world, which families merit close cultivation, which invitations may be declined, how to signal approval or distance through the precise choreography of conversation. In later years, social historians will argue that such domesticity was in fact training in administration, budgets, staffing, and logistics hidden inside parlors and nurseries. The household accounts, preserved in fragmentary form, reveal the scale of this enterprise. A staff of more than 20, including butler, housekeeper, cook, kitchen maids, ladies' maids, footmen, and coachmen. Monthly expenditures on food, wine, flowers, and entertaining that exceed the annual income of middle-class families. Coordination of multiple residences requiring careful inventory and seasonal migration of furniture, art, and personal effects. The household ledger becomes a text in resource allocation. The calling card tray, a lesson in social mapping. Each afternoon, when the cards accumulate on the silver tray in the hall, Lena sorts them with the precision of a strategist. Which calls must be returned within 3 days, which may wait a week, which subtle silence will convey displeasure without overt offense. The cards themselves carry information beyond names, the quality of engraving, the choice of script, even the weight of paper signal the caller's awareness of standards. A poorly engraved card or an error in etiquette, calling too early in the season, appearing without prior introduction, leaving too many cards at once, marks the caller as either ignorant or presumptuous. In the quiet after a dinner party in 1868, Mrs. Astor removes her gloves and writes a series of notes at a small desk, acceptances, regrets, a subtle rearrangement of who will sit where next week. The work is invisible to those who attend her gatherings. They see only the seamless execution, the effortless grace. What they do not see are the hours of planning, the careful calibration of personalities, the anticipation of conflicts before they arise. A contemporary guide to entertaining notes that, successful, hostesses must consider compatibility of temperament, balance of conversational ability, strategic placement of influential guests, and careful attention to dietary restrictions and family feuds. The household ledger and the calling card tray were as instructional as any textbook, teaching that emotional life must be calibrated to social consequence. When New York grows crowded with new fortunes in the 1870s and 1880s, these private skills will become public weapons. In the 1870s and 1880s, as post-war prosperity floods New York, Mrs. Astor allied with Ward McAllister, a Southern-born lawyer and self-appointed arbiter of society. McAllister later recalls her as the Mystic Rose of New York, the figure around whom the social calendar revolved. His memoir, Society as I've Found It, published in 1890, devotes considerable attention to the principles of exclusion he helped codify, the proper size of a dinner party, the rules governing introductions, the careful gradations of invitation. McAllister, born in Savannah in 1827, practiced law briefly before marrying Sarah Gibbons, an heiress, and dedicating himself to what he called the science of society. After spending years in Europe studying aristocratic customs, he returned to America convinced that New York needed more rigorous social standards. His partnership with Mrs. Astor proves symbiotic. She provides the authority and the venue. He provides the public articulation and the willingness to be mocked. Contemporary accounts describe him as a dandy, overly formal, obsessed with protocol to the point of absurdity. yet his influence is undeniable. In March 1888, interviewed by the New York Tribune, McAllister pronounced his famous formula: "There are only about 400 people in fashionable New York society. If you go outside that number, you strike people who are either not at ease in a ballroom or else make other people not at ease." The remark, reprinted and lampooned in newspapers across the country, fixes a number to what Mrs. Astor has long practiced silently: selecting, excluding, smoothing discomfort before it reaches her door. The interview itself reveals McAllister's understanding of social dynamics. He explains that the number derives from practical considerations: the capacity of the largest ballrooms, the size of the opera house boxes, the limits of what one hostess can manage. Quality, he insists, must be maintained. A ballroom crowded with people who do not know how to behave destroys the pleasure of those who do. His language frames exclusion as a form of protection, protecting both the established elite from discomfort and the aspiring newcomers from embarrassment. The codification serves a purpose. By naming the boundary, McAllister makes visible what had been tacit. The number 400, later scholars note, corresponds roughly to the capacity of Mrs. Astor's ballroom, a fact that grounds the abstraction in physical architecture. While McAllister writes and lectures, she continues to adjust seating plans and invitations, her gloved hand turning lists into lived hierarchies. The partnership is symbiotic. He provides the public vocabulary. She provides the private enforcement. Contemporary reactions range from admiration to mockery. Some society matrons embrace the clarity of defined boundaries. Others resent being categorized. Newspapers delight in the presumption, publishing satirical lists of the 400 that include household pets and imaginary characters. One editorial asks, "By what authority does Mr. McAllister presume to count society, and who counted him?" Yet the number sticks, becoming shorthand for New York's social elite and eventually entering common parlance as a measure of exclusivity in any context. The codification of etiquette gave her work a vocabulary, but also exposed it to public scrutiny. What had operated through quiet consensus now became subject to debate, criticism, and resistance. Soon, a single costume ball will test whether even Mrs. Astor must adjust her rules. Chapter 6, 589 words. On a January evening in the early 1890s in her New York house, Mrs. Astor's annual ball, held, as later reminiscences insist, on the third Monday in January, became the most coveted invitation in the city. A New York Times report on 4 February 1896 headlined, "Mrs. William Astor's dance a large ball in her new Fifth Avenue home," describes floral decorations, cotillion leaders, and the procession of names through the ballroom. The article lists attendees with the precision of a social census: Vanderbilts, Gouletts, Livingstons, Van Rensselaers, each name a testament to acceptance. The January ball evolves into an annual ritual whose significance extends far beyond a single evening's entertainment. Invitations, sent on heavy cream stock engraved with Mrs. Astor in flowing script, arrive in mid-December, allowing guests time to order appropriate attire. Contemporary fashion magazines note that the ball sets trends for the season. Colors worn by Mrs. Astor or her daughters appear in shop windows within days. Floral arrangements copied by florists across the city. Music performed by her orchestra requested at subsequent gatherings. Preparation for the ball begins weeks in advance. Florists submit proposals for decorative schemes. Caterers present sample menus. Musicians rehearse programs balancing Viennese waltzes with newer American compositions. Mrs. Astor herself reviews every detail, the placement of floral arrangements to create visual interest without obstructing conversation, the timing of supper to allow adequate dancing without exhausting guests, the selection of cotillion favors that will be both elegant and memorable. A contemporary account describes her attention to logistics. She inspects the ballroom personally, checking sightlines, testing acoustics, ensuring that no guest will stand in a draft or struggle to find refreshment. The ball functions as examination and endorsement. Young women, including Lena's daughters, present themselves in white gowns, gloved to the elbow, their curtsies judged not in public language, but in the private notations of hostesses. Music, light, and the murmur of French phrases mask the calculations which families may safely intermarry, which new fortunes have acquired enough polish to be admitted, which old alliances must be honored or tactfully dissolved. A society columnist writing decades later would observe, to be invited to Mrs. Astor's ball was to exist in New York society. To be omitted was to be erased. The evening follows a prescribed sequence. Guests arrive between 10 and 11 o'clock, announced by a butler whose voice carries across the assembled company. Mrs. Astor receives in the front parlor, flanked by her daughters, greeting each arrival with a personalized comment that demonstrates her command of family connections and recent events. After receiving, guests proceed to the ballroom, where an orchestra plays continuously. Dancing begins with a grand march led by Mrs. Astor and a designated partner, usually a senior male relative or distinguished visitor. Supper is served at midnight in an adjoining dining room, the menu typically featuring 12 courses and requiring 2 hours to complete. The ball concludes around 3 in the morning, with carriages summoned in an order that reflects social precedence. Backstage, in a small dressing room off the main hall, a maid buttons the final pearl on a glove before Mrs. Astor steps into the ballroom, her smile serene, her memory of who has, and has not, called on her perfectly intact. She moves through the crowd with the assurance of one who knows every name, every connection, every unspoken obligation. Public descriptions of flowers and waltzes conceal the ball's function as a gate, not merely a party. Beyond New York, another stage, Newport, extends this curriculum into summer. By the late 1880s, Beechwood was not simply a retreat. It was an extension of New York's drawing rooms onto the cliffs of Newport. Architectural guides emphasize the ballroom Richard Morris Hunt added between 1888 and 1890, designed so that Mrs. Astor could conduct in Newport through the summer months the same elaborate gatherings she orchestrated in the city. Later, walking tour scripts describe the summer ball at Beechwood as the highlight of the season, with large orchestras, 10-course meals eaten off his gold-rimmed china, and a mirrored ballroom opening onto the sea air. Newspapers note the arrival of special trains and steamers for guests, the local economy briefly transformed by the influx of wealth. The Newport season operates according to a calendar as fixed as any academic term, with specific dates for opening cottages, inaugural entertainments, and the closing exodus before autumn. Contemporary society columns chart the season's progress. Which families arrived early? Who hosted the first dinner? What entertainments are planned? The competition for social attention intensifies each summer as new cottages rise along Bellevue Avenue. The Breakers, Marble House, Rosecliff, each more elaborate than the last. Beechwood's summer ball, typically held in mid-August, represents the season's crescendo. Preparations mirror those for the January ball in New York, but adapted to summer conditions. Flowers must be chosen for their ability to withstand evening heat. Refreshments include iced champagne and cold consommé. The ballroom doors remain open to catch ocean breezes. Contemporary accounts describe the setting. As carriages approached up the drive, the house appeared ablaze with light, every window illuminated, Chinese lanterns strung through the gardens, and music drifting across the lawns. On a warm night in August 1891, a group of younger women stood at the edge of the terrace, gloves damp in the salt air, watching Mrs. Astor move through the crowd. Her own gesture, a slight adjustment of a glove before offering her hand, has by now been copied and practiced by those hoping to move within her circle. The imitation is both tribute and strategy. To move as she moves is to signal fluency in the language of her world. The terrace itself, overlooking the Atlantic, becomes a secondary stage for the evening social theater. Here, away from the formal choreography of the ballroom, more candid conversations occur. Marriages are proposed, business alliances formed, family disputes negotiated. The sound of the ocean provides cover for confidential exchanges, while the proximity to the ballroom allows easy return when discretion requires. A memoir from the period describes the terrace at midnight. Groups clustered in the semi-darkness, voices low, the occasional flare of a gentleman's cigar illuminating faces for a moment before returning them to shadow. The Newport season extends from late June through September, a calendar as fixed as any academic term. Within it, a hierarchy of events unfolds: morning calls, afternoon teas, lawn parties, evening dinners, and finally, the grand balls that serve as the season's crescendo. Each event requires specific dress, specific protocol, specific degrees of formality. To navigate the season successfully is to demonstrate mastery of a complex social grammar where a misplaced word or gesture can signal ignorance or presumptuousness. Morning calls in Newport follow different rules than in New York. They occur earlier, last shorter, and allow for less formality. Lawn parties introduce elements, croquet, archery, garden tours, that would be inappropriate in city settings. Casino dances at the Newport Casino on Bellevue Avenue offer younger people opportunities for relatively unsupervised socializing, though chaperones remain present and watchful. The variety of entertainments tests social fluency across multiple contexts, rewarding those who can adapt their performance to changing settings. The finishing school is no longer a single institution in Switzerland or Connecticut. It is any space where behavior under Mrs. Astor's gaze is observed. The next test of that gaze will come not in her own ballroom, but at the opulent threshold of a rival house. On the morning of 16th of February, 1892, the New York Times published The Only 400, presenting, on Ward McAllister's authority, the official list of those admitted to New York's inner circle. The article itself is both a society column and social document, names, addresses, and family connections laid out in type. Though the list bears McAllister's name, contemporary commentators and later historians agree that its logic is inseparable from Mrs. Astor's own guest lists and judgments. The number 400, first voiced in his 1888 Tribune interview, acquires here the permanence of print. The published list includes exactly 273 names, not 400, a discrepancy that immediately draws comment. Some speculate that McAllister excluded certain families to avoid controversy. Others suggest he simply ran out of names that met his criteria. The list organizes New York society into recognizable categories: old Knickerbocker families, Schermerhorns, Van Rensselaers, Livingstons, newer industrial wealth that has achieved acceptance, selected Vanderbilts, and a few prominent figures from arts and letters. Notably, absent are many families of Jewish origin, newer German immigrants regardless of wealth, and most families whose fortunes derive from manufacturing rather than real estate or trade. In the Fifth Avenue brownstone that day, the same woman who once copied French verbs under Mrs. Bensey now reads through the article while a secretary arranges calling cards into separate trays: received, acknowledged, to be considered. A glove removed to turn the pages is replaced before she rises to receive callers. The publication creates both validation and vulnerability. Her authority is confirmed in newsprint, but the mechanism of exclusion, once private, is now exposed to public scrutiny and satire. Cartoonists seize on the number. Editorial writers question the presumption. The New York World runs a satirical piece listing the 400 nobodies, and another featuring the 400 horses owned by society families. Families who find themselves omitted protest. Families who find themselves included quietly savor their confirmation. Some biographies suggest Mrs. Astor herself was ambivalent about the publication, preferring the quiet exercise of influence to its public codification. Her letters, if they address the matter, do not survive. What remains is the list itself, preserved in newspaper archives, a snapshot of New York hierarchy at a moment when industrial wealth was beginning to overwhelm the old Knickerbocker order. The publication also reveals tensions within the social structure. Several families appear with qualifications, if in town or when in residence, suggesting their marginal status. Others are represented by one branch but not another, indicating family disputes or differential acceptance. The list becomes a text to be parsed, analyzed, and contested, transforming what had been fluid and deniable into something fixed and accountable. Contemporary sociologists and historians later point to this moment as pivotal in the evolution of American society. By codifying exclusion, McAllister made it visible and thus vulnerable to democratic critique. What had operated through informal consensus now became subject to questions of legitimacy and fairness. Who grants authority to exclude? On what basis? The questions, once asked, cannot be easily answered, and they begin to erode the very foundations of the system Mrs. Astor represents. Once printed, social power ceases to be entirely private. It becomes a public measure, traceable and contestable. One of the first to contest it will be a woman whose wealth outstrips Mrs. Astor's, but whose pedigree does not, Alva Vanderbilt. On the night of 26th of March, 1883, earlier in the chronology but central to the story's logic, Alva Vanderbilt opens the doors of 660 Fifth Avenue, the so-called Petit Chateau, for a costume ball that contemporary papers will call the event of the decade. The New York Times reports over 1,000 guests, police holding back crowds on the avenue, and an interior drenched in electric light and Worth gowns. The mansion itself, completed only months earlier, is a deliberate challenge to the brownstone restraint of old New York. A limestone chateau imported from French architectural fantasy, its ballroom gilded and mirrored, its staircases scaled for grand entrances. The costume ball represents Alva's strategy for forcing social acceptance. Married to William Kissam Vanderbilt, grandson of railroad magnate Cornelius Vanderbilt, she possesses wealth that dwarfs most old New York fortunes, but lacks the pedigree and social connections that open Mrs. Astor's door. The ball, planned for more than a year, is designed to create a spectacle so magnificent that exclusion becomes impossible. Contemporary estimates place the cost at over $250,000, equivalent to more than $7 million today. A sum that includes not only the evening's expenses but months of preparation, costumes commissioned from Worth in Paris, decorations imported from Europe, rehearsals for elaborate quadrilles, and coordination of more than 100 performers. According to later accounts, Alva initially withholds an invitation to Carrie Astor, Mrs. Astor's youngest daughter, on the grounds that Mrs. Astor has never formally called upon the Vanderbilts, thus lacking an address for the card. The social maneuver succeeds. Mrs. Astor reportedly makes the required call, and the following day, an invitation arrives. Society writers and later historians mark this moment as a hinge when new industrial wealth forces old Knickerbocker society to widen its doors slightly. The ball itself becomes legendary. Contemporary newspapers devote multiple columns to descriptions, guests costumed as Venetian nobles, French courtiers, and characters from literature, quadrilles choreographed to represent different nations, a gymnasium converted into a tropical forest complete with palm trees and exotic birds. The electric lighting, still novel in 1883, allows photographers to document the event, producing images that circulate nationally and establish the Vanderbilt Ball as the standard against which subsequent entertainments are measured. Alva's Ball, with its documented expenses and press coverage stretching across multiple columns, becomes the spectacular counterpart to Mrs. Astor's more controlled gatherings. Where Mrs. Astor cultivates discretion, Alva embraces display. Where Mrs. Astor's power lies in exclusion, Alva's lies in spectacle. The contrast reveals competing strategies for social authority in a rapidly changing city, one rooted in genealogy and restraint, the other in wealth and audacity. The long-term consequences extend beyond a single evening. The Vanderbilts, once definitively outside the inner circle, become fixtures of New York society. Alva's daughter Consuelo will marry the Duke of Marlborough in 1895, a transatlantic alliance that validates the family's social ascent. The ball also establishes a new template for social competition. Future hostesses will attempt to outdo the Vanderbilt spectacle, leading to increasingly elaborate and expensive entertainments that shift society's center from intimate gatherings to public displays. Here, marriage markets and guest lists blur. Admitting the Vanderbilts means admitting the alliances their fortune can purchase. Within the Astor family itself, questions of precedence will soon erupt into a very personal feud over who may call herself Mrs. Astor. In 1887, the death of Charlotte Augusta Gibbes Astor, wife of John Jacob Astor III, leaves Lena as the senior Mrs. Astor in her generation. Shortly thereafter, she drops the William and becomes, socially and in print, simply Mrs. Astor. Her nephew, William Waldorf Astor, who inherits his father's fortune and believes his wife Mary Mamie Astor should hold the title, resents this assertion. The dispute is less about affection than about precedence. In a world where titles signal authority, Mrs. Astor carries weight beyond the personal. The conflict reflects broader tensions within the Astor family about the direction of their fortune and social position. William Waldorf, educated at Columbia and trained in law, briefly served as U.S. minister to Italy before returning to New York with aristocratic pretensions acquired abroad. He believes his wife, as the wife of the family's wealthiest member and heir to John Jacob III's branch, deserves social precedence. Lena, as the widow of the middle son and the woman who has spent decades building the family's social authority, refuses to yield. Contemporary accounts describe increasingly frigid relations between the two households. Invitations are declined, calls go unreturned, and at public events the two women maintain careful distance. Society columns, delighting in the feud, report every slight and counterslight. One columnist notes, "The two Mrs. Astors passed each other at the opera last evening without acknowledgement, a silence more eloquent than words." In 1893, William Waldorf demolished his father's house next door to Lena's brownstone and commissioned the Waldorf Hotel, a 13-story German Renaissance pile whose architects boast of its modern grandeur. Society columns delight in quoting Mrs. Astor's reported remark, "There's a glorified tavern next door." The phrase, whether apocryphal or authentic, captures her distaste for the transformation of residential Fifth Avenue into commercial space. The hotel, with its public ballrooms and dining rooms, represents a shift from private social authority to market-driven hospitality. The Waldorf Hotel, designed by Henry Janeway Hardenberg and opened in 1893, features 450 rooms, electric lighting throughout, and public spaces designed to accommodate large gatherings. Its proximity to Mrs. Astor's residence creates both practical annoyances, increased traffic, noise, commercial activity, and symbolic challenges to her vision of Fifth Avenue as a residential enclave. The hotel's success, attracting both New York society and wealthy visitors from across the country, demonstrates that social gathering spaces need no longer depend on private hospitality or the approval of established hostesses. The feud ends with William Waldorf's departure for England in 1893 and Lena's relocation to a new double mansion further up Fifth Avenue at 65th Street, where she and her son John Jacob Astor IV occupy adjoining residences. The new house, completed in 1896, is larger and more ornate than the brownstone, designed by Richard Morris Hunt in the Beaux-Arts style favored by the newer generation. In photographs taken in the mid-1890s, she appears seated in the new drawing room, gloves folded precisely in her lap, a queen secure on a diminishing throne. The move north signals more than a change of address. Fifth Avenue itself is transforming. Mansions give way to apartment buildings and commercial structures. Families move further uptown or abandon the city altogether for suburban estates. The street's character shifts from residential intimacy to urban grandeur. Mrs. Astor's new residence, grander than the old but surrounded by change, represents both her continued authority and its increasingly fragile foundations. Titles, addresses, and architecture prove to be more than symbols. They are the physical containers of social authority, contested even within families. As the century turns, that authority will erode, not through scandal, but through the slow advance of time and change. By the late 1890s, observers note that Mrs. Astor's active influence was waning. One historian of the family places her peak around 1891, with later years marked by ill health and a changing city. The construction of the combined Waldorf-Astoria Hotel on the site of her old Fifth Avenue brownstone and the eventual move of society events into public ballrooms and charity galas signal a shift from private parlors to more commercial spaces. The social landscape is also changing. Immigration, industrialization, and the rise of mass media are transforming New York faster than any single hostess can control. Contemporary observers note multiple factors in this shift. The proliferation of enormous fortunes, Carnegie in steel, Rockefeller in oil, Morgan in finance, creates a class of wealth that dwarfs even the Astors. These new fortunes, often made in a single generation, lack patience for the slow cultivation of social acceptance. They build larger houses, throw more expensive parties, and court publicity in ways that old New York finds vulgar but cannot ignore. The sheer scale of wealth makes traditional methods of exclusion less effective. When a family can build a palace that makes Beechwood look modest, a withheld invitation stings less. The media landscape also evolves. Illustrated newspapers and magazines, employing photographers and gossip columnists, bring society news to mass audiences. What had been discreetly managed through private channels now plays out in public. Society figures become celebrities. Their homes, their parties, their scandals become entertainment for millions. This publicity both amplifies and undermines social authority. Mrs. Astor's name recognition increases, but so does scrutiny and satire. Newport continues to host summer parties, but younger hostesses, Marion Mamie Fish, Teresa Fair Ulrichs, and Alva Belmont, increasingly compete for attention, their antics and causes covered in a more aggressive, illustrated press. Where Mrs. Astor cultivated discretion, the new generation courted publicity. Where she enforced rigid protocol, they embraced eccentricity and reform. Photographs from this period show Mrs. Astor more often at rest than in motion, her once commanding presence yielding to the frailty of age. Mamie Fish, in particular, represents the changing style. Known for witty remarks and theatrical entertainments, she hosts dinner parties featuring unexpected guests, entertainers, artists, even trained dogs, that would have been unthinkable in Mrs. Astor's era. Tessie Ulrichs transforms Rosecliff into a stage for elaborate tableau and benefit performances. Alva Belmont, divorced and remarried, champions women's suffrage and hosts political meetings in her ballroom, using her social position to advance causes rather than simply to maintain it. In an imagined but plausible scene on a cool evening in 1902, she sits in a Fifth Avenue drawing room, slightly confused by the flood of automobiles outside. A maid slips soft gloves over her hands before she receives a small circle of old friends, women who remember the same vanished New York, the same unspoken codes, the same careful negotiations. The gesture now protects fragile skin rather than displays command. The conversation among these women, drawn from memoirs of the period, dwells on disappearances, families that have left for Europe, estates sold to developers, customs abandoned. One visitor remarks on the prevalence of divorce, once unthinkable in their circle, now increasingly common. Another notes the opening of restaurants that allow respectable women to dine publicly, eroding the centrality of private hospitality. They speak with a mixture of nostalgia and bewilderment, recognizing that their world is passing but uncertain what replaces it. Influence rarely ends in a single scandal. More often, it dissolves quietly as the world rearranges itself around new institutions and new names. Her death will not end the social architecture she helped build, only redistribute its keys. On 30th of October 1908, Caroline Schermerhorn Astor died in her New York home at the age of 78. The New York Times obituary, headlined "Mrs. Astor Dies at Her City Home," recounts her career as leader of New York society and notes that her daughter, Mrs. M. Orme Wilson, was at her bedside. The obituary, respectful but measured, acknowledges her influence while noting that in recent years her activities had been curtailed by declining health. She is buried at Trinity Church Cemetery, where in 1914 her daughter Carrie commissioned the Astor Cross as a memorial, a granite monument marking the family plot where fur trader and society queen lie within the same consecrated ground. The funeral, held at her residence on 65th Street, attracts hundreds of mourners, though contemporary accounts note that many are servants, business associates, and distant relatives rather than the inner circle that had once revolved around her. The social landscape has shifted. Some of her contemporaries have died, others have moved abroad, and the younger generation, while respectful, does not share the older generation's reverence for her particular form of authority. In the years that follow, commentators observe that it takes three women, Marion Mamie Fish, Teresa Fair Ulrichs, and Alva Belmont, to fill the role she once held alone. Beechwood passes to John Jacob Astor Freer, and later histories of Newport note the eerie coincidence that its next master dies on the RMS Titanic in 1912, the sinking a symbol of an era's abrupt end. The Titanic disaster, claiming not only Astor but numerous other prominent society figures, becomes a watershed moment. The confidence and invulnerability of the Gilded Age aristocracy literally submerged in the icy Atlantic. Beechwood itself undergoes various transformations in the decades following Mrs. Astor's death. It serves as a residence for subsequent Astors, briefly operates as a museum in the late 20th century featuring costume interpreters, reenacting Gilded Age society, and eventually returns to private ownership. The house, though preserved, becomes a memorial to a vanished world, its ballroom silent, its rituals performed only for tourists. The Astor family fortune, once concentrated and carefully managed, disperses across multiple branches and generations. Changing tax laws, shifting investment strategies, and the decline of New York real estate's dominance all contribute to the erosion of the concentrated wealth that made Mrs. Astor's social authority possible. By the mid-20th century, the Astor name retains prestige but no longer commands the same overwhelming influence. Decades later, when tourists file through the restored rooms at Beechwood, guide scripts describe the ballroom dimensions, the gilt mirrors, the orchestra gallery. They explain the custom of calling cards, the rules of precedence, the elaborate protocols of formal entertaining, but the scripts necessarily simplify, reducing lived experience to amusing anecdotes, transforming complex social negotiations into quaint customs. Somewhere, in a museum drawer or private archive, an old pair of evening gloves survives, the fingers slightly creased where a hand once tightened them before opening a door. The gloves, preserved in tissue paper, are labeled with a date and provenance. Museum catalogs list them among other artifacts: dance cards, calling cards, pressed flowers from long-ago cotillions, photographs of women in formal dress. Each object carries traces of the world Mrs. Astor shaped but divorced from living context. They can only suggest, never fully restore, what it meant to move through that world. What endures are objects, rooms, and records. What fades are the living negotiations that once gave them meaning. The film closes not on a crowd, but on a still photograph of Beechwood's empty ballroom, chandeliers lit for a tour, polished floor unmarked by dancers, and in a glass case nearby, a single calling card engraved in black script: Mrs. Astor,